Aloha, my name is Victoria Rojas, and today I will be discussing the reformation of the juvenile justice system, primarily dissecting the conservative versus liberal approaches to delinquency. This capstone project is being submitted in partial fulfillment of the administrative practicum requirement for the degree of Bachelor's in Public Administration, concentrating in Justice Administration under the supervision of Dr. Anita Tanner with the University of Hawaii, West Oahu. I will preface this presentation with a quote from former South African revolutionary, political leader, and Nobel Prize winner, the late Nelson Mandela. Our children are our greatest treasure. They are our future. Those who abuse them tear at the fabric of our society and weaken our nation. Our nation's youth has a duty to revive and reinvigorate the growing prominence of our society. Every day, more children are brought into the world with the potential of becoming our future leaders, innovators, scientists, and so on. Therefore, the way society treats its youth determines its future. Likewise, the approach that society takes regarding its youth who break the law says a lot about their degree of humanity, flexibility, and competency for self-conviction. In essence, there is continued debate surrounding the maintenance and future of the current system responsible for our troubled youth, as well as the manner in which said troubled youth should be handled. Should our society stick to the conservative adult time for adult crime approach, or revert to a more rehabilitative community-based approach? Despite the steady decline in youth crime since the 90s, politicians have been partial to being tougher on juveniles after the media depicted more violent crimes being committed by young people and therefore influencing public concern. The purpose of this paper will be to first briefly discuss the historical overview of the juvenile justice system and then move into the research that has analyzed the benefit of keeping youth and adults separated in the criminal justice system, as well as to examine the key issues needing to be identified for reform. Before we begin our historical interview and to maintain contextual integrity of this presentation, the following definitions will be established. The juvenile justice system is the legal structure which administers rehabilitative correction for underage individuals who break the law. In this respect, the age of which individuals are considered juveniles is normally determined by the state, but typically follows the legal definition of a minor, which is any individual under the age of 18. A juvenile delinquent is a minor committing an offense that would be deemed as an illegal crime if it were committed also by an adult, such as assault, robbery, or vehicular theft. Diversely, a status offender is when a minor commits an offense that would not be considered a crime if it were committed by an adult, such as truancy, underage drinking, and smoking. Retributive and restorative justice differ in the case that retributive justice follows a conservative approach of being tough on crime and making an example out of those who don't comply with our laws, while restorative justice values the more liberal approach of rehabilitation and requiring the offender to right their wrongs to the victim and the community. The first juvenile court was established in 1899, over 120 years ago, and it's pictured here in Cook County, Illinois. The basis of the very first juvenile court was that the state was supposed to be responsible to care for its younger population. This premise is known as parens patriae, which evolved from patria potestas and attributed to how in early societies, the children had to obey the father as head of the house or deal with some serious consequences. Over time, every state created its own mandates, determining how they handle their sentencing. Overall, the states had a pretty even approach to handling juveniles in the system that have alternated between the extremes of the rehabilitative and crime control models. A little of what worked and what didn't was taken from each to create this temporary hybrid model. This resulted in the juvenile justice system experiencing an issue in determining if they should continue to carry out harsh corrections for delinquents or to revert back to restorative treatment. The 5 stages that contributed to the evolution of the system to what it is today included the Puritan period, the refuge period, the juvenile court period, the juvenile rights period, and the crime control period. So the Puritan period was birthed from the ideologies of like the early colonists that came from England, which is where the concept of an organized justice system came and originated from. So during this era, it was believed that children were genetically sinful and needed to be controlled through punishment. The first law pertaining to juveniles was called the Stubborn Child Law, and it was enacted in 1646, and it recognized a distinction between punishing children and adults, depending on the crime, and it also initiated the need for institutions for children to essentially learn how to be useful for society. The main method of control was through family along with the church. Additionally, the country experienced or went through the Industrial Revolution, and with that came severe stress for all of the families involved, followed by a trend of brutal methods of correction, regardless of the children's age. This prompted for the system's first reform and eventually transitioned into the refuge period. So the refuge period saw the creation of, the official creation of juvenile treatment facilities, and they eventually became known as foster homes, reform schools, and youth organizations like the YMCA. So these establishments protected children from getting locked up, and Parens Patriae was adopted with several reform groups, holding the belief that society owed more to the children while others just wanted the wayward children to conform so they wouldn't be a threat to society. They believed children could be as good as long as they were removed from their toxic environments. The juvenile court period was the start of the progressive era that pretty much similarly concluded that children weren't inherently sinful, but they were a product of a bad society. In 1899, the Juvenile Court Act maintained that, quote, impressionable and salvageable youths, quote, unquote, should not be mixed in with the general adult population. This ideology stated that youth acting out was to be expected, but if severe, it would be handled by the public following the guidance of research. More child welfare and subsidy programs were eventually established during this period, such as the Child Labor Laws and Social Security Act of 1935. Next, the juvenile rights period kick-started the liberal rehabilitative approach after an increase in offenses in crime data. So community-based therapy and the suggestion of decriminalization were very popular treatments. However, after coming under fire for those programs being improperly or poorly implemented and a lack of research at the time, policymakers urged for a more tougher approach, and that gave birth to the current crime control period. It set the precedence of treating kids more harshly in order to discourage them from engaging in future offending behavior. However, this placed an overwhelming amount of authority in police hands, in turn weakened community policing efforts, and it contributed to trauma in high-risk teens that lived in high-risk neighborhoods. As a result, researchers are at a crossroads to figure out which method is best for treating our youth to lower recidivism rates and to set them up for success. So historically, conservatives are the ones who are in favor of eliminating the juvenile justice system, but there are politicians and academics from both sides of the coin that criticize the system and have been contending to dissolve it into one continuous operation for both adults and juveniles. They assert that having a separate system for juveniles has not been proving effective for those young people committing more serious crimes. And many critics have agreed that if those repeat delinquents of the more violent offenses would have been initially transferred over to adult criminal court on their repeat offense, there could be more focus and resources for the goals for those vouching for a system focused on restorative justice with non-violent offenders. The conservative side of the argument holds that a crime is a crime regardless of the age of the offender, and if they are punished appropriately, it will deter them from engaging in any future criminal activity. As a reminder, the juvenile justice system was created because young people still had a lot of developing to do mentally, emotionally, and cognitively, and thus early intervention for troubled youth was the best way to help sway them off the wrong path. So theoretically, it is counterproductive to the purpose of the juvenile justice system to dissolve it and transfer minors to adult criminal processing for the purpose of just lessening the traffic and alleviating costs. The main goal for our at-risk youth is to promote a healthier advantage for a higher likelihood of success, and consequently, it lowers the crime rate and protects society. Sending youth through adult criminal facilities is a great disservice to their overall well-being. The bottom line is adolescents do not know any better because the prefrontal cortex of their brain responsible for abstract thinking and reasoning is still underdeveloped, which I will go into detail in the next slide. So this infographic shows the human brain at 5 separate developmental stages from ages 5 to 20. The area of the brain that controls executive functions, to include impulse control and determining the weight of lifelong consequences, is called the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. It's one of the last parts of the brain to fully develop, and it doesn't fully reach maturity until the early 20s. So the colorful parts of the neuroimaging shown here depicts the brain density over time. So red and yellow show the brain's gray matter density as denser in earlier stages of life, and then eventually turning purple, which signifies less density, and it means that the brain has nearly completed finishing the pruning process, or better known as just finishing developing overall. So why do juveniles commit offenses? Aside from brain development we discussed in the previous slide, circumstantially speaking, young people who get involved in illegal behaviors have the typical risk factors of experiencing a rough childhood, unstable home life with neglectful parents, poor family income, peer pressure, substance abuse, and poor education. The kids who normally get processed through the system are the kids coming from broken homes with parents who had spent time in the system themselves. This theory is based upon the social development model that suggests children learn behaviors and attitudes, and then they associate themselves with similar people to bond with. Kind of like the saying, you tell me who your friends are and I'll tell you who you are. So this data comes from a 2019 report by the Prison Policy Initiative. Over 48,000 youth are being housed in some kind of facility, ranging from treatment centers and detention centers and group homes. The largest piece of this pie are young offenders being held in detention centers. Out of the nearly 17,000 offenders, over 10,000 are being held for a non-violent crime that didn't involve another person. So as you can see, a staggering amount of young people are involved within the juvenile justice system, and we should be doing more to minimize these numbers. In addition to the overall number of youth in our system, a significant percentage of those young offenders are minorities, primarily African Americans. So generally, youth offending has been steadily decreasing since the 90s, like I mentioned before. But data is showing that more minorities are being processed through the system than white individuals, despite that decline. So why are minorities overrepresented in the criminal justice system? So the severe gaps in socioeconomic status are a huge contributor, as well as a lack of resources to low-income communities, which is reflected in the crime rates of the corresponding areas. It illustrates the sort of domino effect that makes its way back around in a vicious cycle, starting with dwindling social programs, resources, and funding that puts monumental stress on the parents and guardians in that community. So that stress manifests into home front issues such as abuse and all sorts of forms towards children because they're easy targets to take that stress out on. Then the abuse poses several psychological effects that stunts areas of the brain responsible for smart decision-making and overall sound judgment, which then inspires the challenging behaviors that land minority youth in the category of juvenile delinquent. So as a result, stereotypes transpire, and African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans are painted as troublemakers and are therefore criminalized at an early age, to the point where majorly Black students are being arrested by school resource officers, for example, at a disproportionate rate. As of 2013, I believe, Black juveniles were more than 4 times as likely to be committed as white juveniles. So the debate at hand is a 2-part issue. The first being which approach is best as the foundation of handling young offenders, the tough on crime or the rehabilitative. The second is whether or not we should keep a separate system for adults and minors. If the juvenile justice system is dissolved, then we would be looking at the option of transferring older youth to adult facilities to carry out their time. And according to one of the researchers for this presentation, or for this paper that I had read in Stahl, analyses of delinquent cases shows that only a small amount of juveniles have been seeing the need to transfer over to criminal court due to the nature of their offenses and how much time they have until they quote unquote age out. But of those who do get transferred over, they are so much more likely to suffer from sexual abuse and mental trauma, which can translate into increased recidivism rates. So yes, automatically transferring juveniles to adult court would theoretically decrease the data on the juvenile crime rate on paper, but in turn, it would decrease the numbers for adults. It would increase the numbers for adults. Not really much of an effect on crime in general. So juvenile centers are best to maintain for younger offenders because they're less populated, with smaller staff to inmate ratios, emphasis on treatment rather than punishment, more available resources such as counseling, therapy, mentorship programs, and academic programs to encourage youth to finish school. Keeping juveniles in their own rehabilitative facilities are beneficial to society because they're more likely to be encouraged on a better path. Learning thought and behavior patterns that are designed to help make them more productive members of society. Preventing delinquency could also come into the forms of initiatives that establish behavior codes, removing graffiti in communities, implementing conflict prevention strategies, and developing plans for personal crisis management. Yes, forgive me. I lost my place for a second. Unfortunately, not every juvenile facility is equipped with the resources that I previously mentioned that would help young ones off the path of destruction. So politicians are needing to go back to the drawing board for several issues that must be reconsidered, such as effective aftercare, mental health treatment, racial fairness, community-based alternatives, right-sizing jurisdictions, and evidence-based practices, which is the rehabilitative approach that we're discussing, and juvenile defense. So for example, and for the sake of time, because I know that it's already kind of going a little long, I'll discuss the first of the key issues and details, which is effective aftercare, and it involves ensuring youth successes in their communities post-release. So community agencies and schools should feel prepared and ready to welcome these kids on their return. So these reintegration programs should begin before they're even released, and they should help youth acquire the necessary job skills to lock in employment, as well as be given the chance to earn school credits or earn degrees so they don't fall behind on their education, depending on how old they are, obviously. So what can we do to ensure our children's safety and in turn the future of a productive society? So we know that new data has emerged regarding human brain development and research on effectiveness that substantiates the better approach is to maintain separation for juveniles, as well as deeply consider the prospect of total reform. The best course of action is to focus on deinstitutionalization, putting more emphasis on community-based alternatives and participation, and protecting youth from inappropriate intake procedures and keeping them out of adult prisons. The obligation to protect society by securing public safety is just as important as protecting wayward youth from spiraling deeper into criminal tendencies and getting stigmatized by institutionality. So reforming an entirely new process that helps discern low and high risk offenders would be helpful in determining who would benefit from certain treatment programs outside of a detention center. Obviously, very dangerous and violent repeat offenders would need to be held in a separate facility, while having the chance to still participate in these same rehabilitative programs, but under scrutiny to ensure public safety. So they would still have that chance, but obviously under a very watchful eye. Those rehabilitative programs would be largely community-based, and they would provide incentives for offending youth to not return, such as free vocational training, resume workshops, mental health, self-care workshops. And to be completely honest, most of the youth who revert to these illicit and criminal behaviors, they are kids who are unaware to any sense of mental health, and they need to be properly educated on how to handle those personal aspects of identity. And with each change in administration, it's just going to continue to be difficult to keep continuity in our criminal policies as a nation. Therefore, it's our responsibility to keep political bias out of the future for our children and making decisions with their best interests in mind rather than keeping them locked away. So it is evident that the juvenile justice system is at a crossroads, like I had mentioned, and policy is submitting to a course of progression. Politicians are coming to realize that the efforts of the punitive, tough on crime approach for minors that most conservatives pushed for before has yielded impotent results and immense economic costs. Public attitudes regarding the reformation of the juvenile justice system reflect the majority of a society in agreement that putting kids behind bars without offering the attempt at rehabilitation is just giving up on them, point blank. And we owe so much more to these children. Young people have the potential to change because they're still young, and implementing more treatment and rehabilitative programs are more likely to set them on a better path than locking them up and throwing away the key. The United States is starting to operate based on the analysis of minimizing criminalization and investing in the endorsed alternatives, locking in a safer future for our younger communities. That is the end of my slideshow. Here are my references, and thank you so much.